This video on Gail Rubin's Thinking Sex might be a little bit longer than normal. For that, I apologize. It's just there's so much in here that we should cover. So I want to make sure that we get into it. I'm going to be very brief over the history that she talks about in the first part of her essay. I think that you can look in those sections a little bit more in detail if you want more of the details. But I'm just going to give us a broad overview so that we have an idea just of how historical all of these recognitions are, or rather just how sex has been regulated in society, at least Western society, for a very long time. So we start out, sex is always political. The realm of sexuality has its own internal politics, inequities, and modes of oppression. And we see a couple different moves here. In the Victorian era, for example, we see the educational and political campaigns encouraging chastity, the elimination of prostitution, the discouraging of masturbation, to the apparatus of social, medical, and legal enforcement covering issues of sex, medical practice, child rearing, parental anxiety, police conduct, and sex law. Current views about the impermissibility of sexual knowledge and masturbation, as well as sex law concerning anti-obscenity and laws banning contraceptive and abortifacient drugs, follow from a 19th century idea about sex. Most laws used to arrest homosexuals and prostitutes actually come out of Victorian campaigns against, quote, white slavery, laws against solicitation, lewd behavior, loitering, age offenses, and brothels. In the 1950s, the focus centers around the homosexual menace and the sex offender. The latter term applies to rapists, child molesters. It functions as a code for homosexuals eventually. In bureaucratic, medical, and popular versions, the lines were blurred between consensual and non-consensual acts. So sexual psychopath laws swept through state legislatures, giving police powers over homosexuals and other sexual deviants. And I think the key here is to keep realizing how, despite maybe things that are certainly things that we don't want to see in society, how they are used to embolden the state to have power over those that society consider to be homosexual or otherwise sexually deviant. The FBI also during this time began systematic surveillance and harassment of homosexuals lasting well into the 1970s. And I have a video on the course supplemental research that you should watch. It's called How Florida Legally Terrorized Gay Students, and it's worth a watch to kind of see how this stuff has affected people's lives and how it operated around this time. Now, San Francisco is sometimes conceived of as a gay mecca, but even in San Francisco during this time, police and media waged a war on homosexuals throughout this period. Police raided bars, patrolled cruising areas, conducted street sweeps, and so on. And this really occurred throughout the country. So I also have a required viewing for this section, the Stonewall Forever mini documentary. I highly recommend that you watch that just so you can kind of see where Stonewall started and why we have gay pride, why we have pride period, not just for the gay community, but for all members of the LGBT plus community, and how this really originated out of a response to this kind of oppression. So for over a century, no tactic for stirring up erotic hysteria has been as reliable as the appeal to protect children. Shortly before the Dade County vote, which was a vote in Florida to repeal the gay rights ordinance, a concern with child pornography swept the media. Legislation quickly and overwhelmingly passed instituting harsh penalties for the acquisition of any depiction of minors who are nude or engaged in sexual activity. Rubin argues that these were ill-conceived and misdirected, and that they represent far-reaching alterations in the regulation of sexual behavior and abrogate important sexual civil liberties. The campaign against child pornography ultimately ignited long-simmering passions of the American right and sparked an extensive movement to compress the boundaries of sexual behavior. So these were seen as the beginning or the start or a way of enforcing legally the violations of the rights of particularly the gay community. So 1969, the right attacks the Sex Information and Education Council of the US, claiming that the sex education itself is a communist plot to destroy the family and sap the national will, to undermine religious taboos, to promote abnormal sexual relations, to destroy racial cohesion by, for example, exposing white women to the, quote, lower standards, sexual standards of Black people. And we also see the same stuff today when we look at education of LGBT issues in school or education of trans issues in school. It's conceived by at least the right that we have today as some kind of plot to try to make kids gay or make kids trans, which, if you know anything about what it is to be gay or trans, that's just not how it works. The Family Protection Act was offered, but did not pass. It was a broad assault on feminism, homosexuals, non-traditional families, and teenage sexual privacy. Part of that involved a teen chastity program, where $15 million was slated to encourage teenagers from refraining from sexual intercourse, discourage their use of contraceptives, and having abortions. So the upshot here is that the struggles fought through these periods, they leave a residue of laws, social practices, and ideologies, which affects the way that sexuality is experienced. So there's two conceptions of sex that we might have, and it's similar to our understandings of gender as well. So we can have a sexual essentialism, which is really the idea that sex is a natural force that exists prior to social life and shapes instead institutions. Sex is ahistorical, it's unchanging, it's asocial. According to this view, sex is a property of individuals. It resides perhaps in their hormones or their psyches. So there's two conceptions of sex that we might have. So there's sexual essentialism. This is the idea that sex is a natural force that exists prior to social life and rather shapes institutions. Sex is ahistorical, it's unchanging, and it's asocial. According to this view, sex is a property of individuals. It resides in their hormones or psyches. This view has been upheld by academia, it's been upheld by medicine and psychiatry and psychology. These are not inconsequential institutions. We also see this in a lot of the kind of concerns or issues that were raised, I guess, in the early 2000s about homosexuality, this idea that we need to find a gay gene. It's also present in some people's claims or desires to find the trans gene or the cause for people being transgender in this kind of deeply essentialist way. She says, though this is true, the assault on homosexuality is actually relatively modern and, can't explain that phenomenon. Instead, we should look at sexual constructivism. So if you can't tell, Gail Rubin supports this interpretation. Desires are not just pre-existing biological entities. Instead, so it's not just that you have these desires and that shapes institutions. Instead, institutions or social practices shape our desires. Biological practices are surely important, but human sexuality is not comprehensible purely in biological terms. The belly's hunger gives no clue to the complexities of cuisine. It's another way of saying that procreation or the procreative biological demands for procreation, that does not exhaust the understanding of human sexuality. It is impossible to think with any clarity about the politics of race or gender as long as these are thought of as biological entities rather than as social constructs. Similarly, sexuality is impervious to political analysis as long as it is primarily conceived as a biological phenomenon, or just an aspect of individual psychology. Sexuality is as much a human product as our diets, methods of transportation, systems of etiquette, forms of labor, types of entertainment, processes of production, and modes of production. And in the context of Western society, these kinds of institutions have framed sexuality within an incredibly punitive social framework, subject to very real formal and informal controls. So 5 ideological formations that grip sexual thought in Western societies are given, and we're going to go through each one. So there's sex negativity. In Western cultures, sex is generally considered dangerous, destructive, and negative. It is inherently sinful, and it can only be performed for procreative purposes, and so long as no one enjoys oneself too much. Sex is basically bad unless there's an explicit reason to exempt this badness. So marriage, reproduction, love, etc. The use of erotic capacity, intelligence, curiosity, creativity all require certain pretexts that we don't require for any other biological functioning, like eating food or athleticism, for example. There's also the fallacy of misplaced scale, a burden of excess significance. So this idea that sex is really, really, really important. So the idea that heretical sex deserves then the harshest punishments. So anal penetration is a grounds for execution. And that is legitimately a perspective that has occurred in the history of Western thought. Small differences in value or behavior are then exploded into these cosmic threats for society. So we're allowed to be silly about what constitutes proper diet, say, but differences in menu rarely provokes the rage, anxiety, and terror that accompanies differences in erotic taste. So the idea here is that the erotic taste or orientation of individuals has this incredible significance in our society, to the point that it incurs or creates in people rage, anxiety, and terror in ways that we don't see in other cases. And we'll talk more about this in the context of violence. But this reminds me of the kinds of defenses that are given by people who have sexual intercourse or relations with trans people and then later find out that they're trans. So if you're not familiar, the trans panic defense is an actual defense that people use in a court of law and that are acceptable to be used in a court of law as a defense for murdering trans people that someone has killed. So the general story is someone has sexual intercourse with a trans person, usually a trans woman, and usually the murderers tend to be trans women of color. And then in court, defend the act by virtue of the panic that was induced in them by realizing that they had sexual attraction to a trans person. And this often is used as a way of getting people off of murder and relegated to certain manslaughter charges instead. So the idea is that you are so distraught by recognizing that someone is trans that you murdered them. This is a map of all the states that have prohibitions on the use of the trans panic defense. The dark green are states or territories that don't allow the use of the trans panic defense in the court system. Everywhere else, you may use this defense to some success, to a surprising amount of success, one might think. So, rage, anxiety, and terror are very real things, and the cause of very real consequences for people in marginalized communities. Hierarchical valuation of sex acts. So there is a hierarchy of which sex acts are permitted or considered better than others. Marital reproductive heterosexuals are at the top. Below are the unmarried monogamous heterosexuals and couples, and maybe other heterosexuals. Solitary sex, like masturbation, is somewhat ambiguous. Stable long-term lesbian and gay couples are nearing respectability at the time that she wrote this. Bar dykes and promiscuous gay men are at the next level, near the bottom. At the very bottom are transgender folks. So she doesn't use this language, but the correct language would be transgender people. Fetishists, kinksters, sex workers, and the lowest are those whose eroticism transcends generational boundaries. So this would include pedophiles. Punitive stigma maintains sexual behavior performance. So intensity of the stigma derives in medical and psychiatric doctrine, at least for most cases in the contemporary case. A lot of this is religiously motivated, but we also see it reflected in medical and psychiatric doctrine as well. A very good example is the DSM. This is the American Psychological Association's guide for diagnosing certain psychological disorders, right? You can look at it as almost a reliable map of the current moral hierarchy. So the DSM-3, we're now on, I think, the 5th, removed homosexuality from the roster of mental disorders, but it keeps the lower castes intact, right? So transgender folks, fetishists, kinksters, etc. Those are considered mental disorders. Now, currently, I think in the DSM-5, I know that being transgender is not included. That was actually a change from DSM-4, though gender dysphoria is included. So trans people can get treatment for gender dysphoria. But being transgender itself is not considered a mental illness of any sort. Now, these categorizations invoke a certain mental and emotional inferiority. Like to this day, many people see people that are transgender as having a mental illness. This is a common, at least conservative talking point. Now, these hierarchies intermingle with other issues and markers: sexual sin, national security, xenophobia, etc. And culture itself replicates these features. So next week, or at least in the next section, I'm going to have you look at the Disclosure film on Netflix for an example for how this happens. It also fits in our general notion of how gender is policed in our society. Media representation is just one case of this. The function of this hierarchy is ultimately to rationalize the well-being of the sexually privileged and the adversity of the sexual rabble. So one is to remain then in the charmed circle. And I will show you this in a moment. So the charmed circle is this circle on the inside. And there's a dividing line here between what's considered good sex and what's considered bad sex or unacceptable sex. The people on the outside of the charmed circle are considered social deviant or sexual deviants of some sort, and then are correspondingly subjected to some kind of punitive measure. So we can go through here. What's the charmed circle? Well, it's vanilla sex as opposed to kinky sex. It's heterosexual. It's in a married relationship. It's monogamous. It's procreative. It's free as opposed to paid for. It's coupled instead of in groups or alone. It's in a relationship instead of casual. It's with the same generation instead of cross-generational. It's at home, and it does not involve pornography or manufactured objects. It's just bodies. Anyone that's on the outside, you could be on the outside in many different ways, right? Think of the kinds of criticism people have with swingers, right? Considered not acceptable, or people that are kink shamed for participating in the S&M community, or people who are gay, or people who are outside of marriage, who are having sex in public, or involve pornography, or videotape themselves. Now, some of these things are going to be changing, right? Part of what it is to develop in our society is to change where the line is being drawn of what is good sex or not. And she has another graphic that kind of helps with this. There's this line that we have, right? So we have the best to the worst. So you have heterosexual, married, monogamous, reproductive, at home people. This is all considered good, normal, and natural, and healthy. And the line here is here. And then, we might move the line every once in a while to maybe unmarried heterosexual couples are acceptable, or promiscuous heterosexuals, or maybe masturbation is considered to be more healthy. Long-term stable lesbian and gay male couples, lesbians in the bar, promiscuous gay men in the baths or the park. Probably not quite here yet, right? At least on average. And then way at the bottom are people like transgender folks, people that cross-dress, fetishists, sadomasochists, people that have sex for money, so sex workers. This is all abnormal or unnatural or sick or sinful. It's way out of the area of acceptability. One thing that we notice is that a very small portion of human sexual capacity is sanctifiable, safe, healthy, mature, or legally or politically correct. Another element here is the domino theory of sexual peril. So if anything transcends the line of permitted, then supposedly chaos will ensue. Most systems of sexual judgment attempt to determine on which side of the line the act falls. Now, this is not really sexual morality, right? For her, it's more in common with, say, ideologies of racism than with true ethics. So it grants virtue to the dominant groups and relegates vice to the underprivileged. A democratic morality, another way of doing sexual morality, would be to judge sexual acts by the way that partners treat one another, the level of mutual consideration, the presence or absence of coercion, the quantity and quality of the pleasures they provide, instead of these kind of categorizations of this is good sex, that is bad sex, on these kind of compulsory heterosexual or heteronormative lines. Okay, so the final point is that there's a lack of a concept of benign sexual variation, or sexual variation that doesn't have any significance, or moral significance, or weight, or political significance. Humans just are sexually plural. We've seen this with Kinsey reports and so on. We know this to be true. But our concepts in society demand conformity to a single standard. Most people mistake their sexual preferences for a universal system that will or should work for everyone. There is no just benign, you go do you kind of perspective. Now, I think this might be changing. I mean, this is commonly noted to have changed for millennials and maybe even more so for Generation Z. But on average, we still live in a world where the political structures, the economic structures, the societal structures, the laws that are in place distribute benefits and burdens according to whether you are on the right side of the line here. Okay, so there are 3 different sexual phenomena that we can kind of point out to now. So there's sexual transformation first. So sexual types are produced by social forces. What Western Europe and the United States see as a gay man is very different from different cultural practices of man and man in sexual intercourse. So she wants to argue the very concept of homosexual man that our culture has in mind is a product of our society. There's a relocation of homoeroticism into these kind of quasi-ethnic, nucleated, sexually constituted communities, and that's to some extent a consequence of the transfers of population brought by industrialization. So we see sexually motivated migrations in cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and LA. And I have you watch the documentary on Stonewall in part because you get to see just how territorial certain communities have become. Prostitution also follows a similar trajectory, so this is not relegated just to one aspect of the uncharmed circle. Originally a temporary job, prostitutes became increasingly isolated due to reform and police persecution. Like gay men, prostitutes occupy demarcated urban territories and battle with police to defend and maintain those territories. The legal persecution of both populations is justified by an elaborate ideology classifying them as dangerous and inferior. So there are shared experiences when your sexual activities are not considered part of the charmed circle. And just to drive this home a little bit more, you can see different communities that have been somewhat ghettoized as gay ghettos, right? So there's Boys Town in Chicago. There's Hillcrest here in San Diego. There's the Castro in San Francisco. You have Greenwich Village in New York. This is where the Stonewall riots occurred. You have West Hollywood in LA. These are all places that have been part of this kind of sexual transformation, right? And sexual stratification here. So, and they're the sites of sexual conflicts. So we'll go through each of these in a moment. So sex law itself is an instrument of sexual stratification and erotic persecution. The state routinely interferes in sexual behavior in ways that would not be tolerated in other areas of social life. Enforcement is largely in the hands of local police. Sex law is incredibly harsh, It's universally out proportioned to the social or individual harm, and sex laws are notoriously incredibly easy to pass. So laws impinging on sexual commerce renders sex workers vulnerable to exploitation and bad working conditions. The law is also ferocious in maintaining the boundary between childhood innocence and adult sexuality. So rather than having a society that recognizes sexuality of the young and then attempts to provide for it in a caring and responsible manner, our culture denies and punishes any erotic interest and activity by anyone under the local age of consent. These laws then make no distinction between the most brutal rape and the most gentle romance. And Rubin remarks that it's legal for young people to see hideous violence, but then not the explicit pictures of genitalia or any kind of sexual intercourse of any sort. And that seems like a very clear case of where we can see how sex in our society is considered very negative, worse than violence. So anyone who deviates too much from the charmed circle can be denied contact with the young. So lesbians, gay men, prostitutes, swingers, sex workers, transgender folk, promiscuous women have all been declared unfit to be parents. Teachers can lose their jobs if they have unconventional lifestyles. There have been recent cases in the last several years where a teacher is a sex worker on the side and then loses her job because of those images on the internet or whatever. So the only adult sexual behavior that's actually legal in every state is the placement of the penis in the vagina in wedlock. Anti-sodomy statutes prohibit anal and oral sex. The law is saying that these acts are so incredibly vile that no one should be able to perform them. Sexual diversity itself is limited by social mores, family disapproval. In the workplace, one is pressured not to be out or to perform, like we saw with Rich, heterosexual norms. Only this year in 2020 did the Supreme Court rule that workplace discrimination against gay and transgender people is illegal. Gay marriage itself became federally legal only in 2015. So all of this is to say that sex is a vector of oppression. The system of sexual oppression cuts across other modes of social inequity, sorting out individuals and groups according to its own intrinsic dynamics. In its most serious manifestations, the sexual system is a Kafkaesque nightmare in which unlucky victims become herds of human cattle whose identification, surveillance, apprehension, and treatment, incarceration, and punishment produce jobs and self-satisfaction for thousands of vice police, prison officials, psychiatrists, and social workers. It is a thoroughly political institution. Sexual politics is characterized also by sexual conflict. So there are definitional wars over the classification of individuals and sexual behavior. So homosexuality and transgender status in medical context would be a good example of this. There are legal wars over the prohibition of vice and sex law. And there's also territorial and border wars. So if you look at the cases here, Greenwich Village, for example, Stonewall was a response to increased political violence or consistent police violence against the gay and the LGBT community more broadly. So we can think of Hillcrest, Castro, Greenwich Village, Boys Town, and West Hollywood in this way. Sexual minorities have had to counter negative propaganda about their communities to find out how to occupy and live in marginal sexual worlds. They've had to be able to afford to travel to queer communities, and queer communities have had to fight against continued gentrification. So there's this territory claiming that is occurring, and this pushing out and pushing away of queer communities. This has happened in the context of the end of lesbian bars, for example. I think Gossip Girl in Hillcrest is one of the few remaining lesbian bars in the nation. Churches and anti-vice forces put pressure on local authorities to contain certain areas. These are policed neighborhoods. Sexual stratification provides easy victims for those who lack power to defend themselves. Moral panics then sweep through populations and decimate sexual minorities. Criminalization of innocuous behaviors are justified by protecting health and safety, women and children, national security, the family, or civilization in general. The anti-kink movement of some feminists, and there's the co-opting of feminist language for criminalizing consensual behavior. You can look at page 163 for the beginning of this conversation. There's also the use of by the right of the AIDS pandemic, or as an AIDS panic, to suppress the gay community. Some people think that, or take it to be, a punishment for the gay community. She marks out that there are limits to feminism to address these issues. She marks out that there's two different branches within feminism. There's a sexual liberation branch and a sexual suspicion branch. And I would suggest that Adrienne Rich identifies a kind of sexual suspicion, at least of a particular kind of sexual expression. But first, there's this idea that restrictions on women's sexual behavior is unjustified, and there are too high a cost garnered against women who are sexually active. This would be the sexual liberation idea. This would be something that sexual liberation is a goal. Then there's the sexual suspicion view, which sees sexual liberation really as just serving the interests of men and servicing male privilege. This is also associated with the anti-pornography movement, which Rubin criticizes. So those that see sexual expression as anti-feminist replace monogamous lesbianism within the long-term intimate relationships. They place that monogamous lesbianism within long-term intimate relationships. They replace the procreative heterosexuality top of the hierarchy level with monogamous lesbianism. I think it's fair to say Adrienne Rich fits this description. Heterosexuality is then placed in the middle, and everything else is basically represented as the same. You can even read in Adrienne Rich's work a little bit of animosity towards and wanting to separate oneself from gay male communities or gay men communities. She says, look, this view represents most sexual behavior in the worst possible light. It describes erotic conduct in the worst available way and then treats it as representative. Further, the anti-porn movement is a massive scapegoat, directing legitimate anger at women's lack of personal safety against innocent individuals and practices and communities. So sure, the sex industry has problems, but it is sexist just as any other, and clearly that deserves attention and dismantling. But erotic minorities like kinksters and then trans folks, they're just as likely to exhibit sexist attitudes and behavior as any other random group. A good deal of feminist literature attributes oppression of women to graphic representation of sex, prostitution, sex education, S&M, male homosexuality, being a transgender person or transsexual. Whatever happened, she asks, to the family, religion, education, child-rearing practices, the media, the state, psychiatry, job discrimination, and unequal pay? Why are we not talking about those as having the role of oppressing women? Ultimately, what she thinks is produced is just a conservative sexual morality. So pro-sex feminism has been spearheaded by lesbians whose sexuality does not conform to the movement standards of purity. So the idea of lesbian sadomasochism and butch femme dykes, which you actually see Adrienne Rich criticizing. Some of the claims about the butch femme identities by feminists, particularly of the sort of sexual suspicion, is that there's just this replication of heterosexual norms. But that has been largely criticized against. Anyway, by unapologetic heterosexuals and by women who adhere to classic radical feminism rather than to the revisionist celebrations of femininity, which have become common in feminist circles. So this is her criticism of feminism here. She also discusses two other features that I'll briefly note on here, but the importance of consent. Right, so in sodomy laws, adult incest laws, and legal interpretations of consent for the purposes of kink, these interfere with consensual behavior and impose, and then there are criminal penalties imposed on this behavior. So within the law, consent is really just considered a privilege enjoyed by those who engage in the highest status sexual behavior. those who enjoy low status sexual behavior don't have a legal right to engage in it. So an example is that someone, she gives a court case example where someone is ruled out as being incapable of giving consent because they're consenting to being flogged with a flogger. So engaging in sadomasochistic sexual intercourse is itself a grounds to indicate that someone is not in their right mind to consent to something. And this is a problem. This means that the law only sees those as engaging in high status sexual behavior as having the ability to consent. So if deviants do not respond to manipulations of the social system, then psychology is a kind of last resort. This behavior is explained by a bad childhood, by unsuccessful socialization, by inadequate identity formation, as opposed to a benign sexual variation. And on the issue of gender, modern ideology of sex is that lust is the province of men and purity is the province of women. So in the sex industry, women are excluded from most production and consumption. Gender affects the operation of the sexual system. So we ought to separate oppression of lesbians qua lesbians and lesbians qua women. Lesbians have shared many of the sociological features and suffer many of the same penalties as gay men, S&M practitioners, trans people, and prostitutes. She kind of gives a jab at feminists like Adrienne Rich, saying, as much as you don't want to be lumped in with this group of people, you are. Feminist theory, which subsumes sexuality into gender, is ultimately misleading. Feminism itself cannot be the ultimate and complete account of all social inequality. We also need an independent theory of sex. And that's something that Gail Rubin appears to be providing us, or at least the beginnings of which. So I know that this was long. Hopefully it was illuminating. If you want more detail, this article is packed full with historical context and examples that you can use to further flesh out your understanding that you have hopefully derived from this lecture.